Good morning. Oh, good, Walter, A1? All right, sweet. Lovely to see you all again. Hope you all had a fantastic week, and glad that we are all able to come back together and relook at Habakkuk. Now, last week we started the covering of chapter 1, verses 5 through 11, which is God's reply to all of Habakkuk's groanings and complaints that he makes against the people of Judah. And we got to look at the history of Nebuchadnezzar according to the historians and found the parallels between what is described about Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians in God's summation of them to be very true. And Rob Diesta was kind enough to further elaborate more on about the differences in warfare that the Babylonians had compared to the Egyptians and the other nations at that time. And I appreciate you bringing that out once again. We also mentioned the fact that this was a temporary punishment or judgment against the people of Judah, and that the Babylonians were not indeed guiltless, but rather guilty of worshiping their own strength, or depending on your translation, imputing power to their false gods. And as I said, it's all depending on the translation. Now, I'm planning to start shifting gears from the historical aspect, but before doing that, I was curious if there were any other comments or any other thoughts that had generated in your all's minds during the past week in relation to the history of the Babylonians that you'd like to mention at this time before we start changing gears. All righty, so I don't see any hands, so we are going to continue on with, before rereading Habakkuk 5 verse 1 through 11, chapter 1, 5 through 11. Let me get my tongue back under control. Let's read Deuteronomy 28 verses 49 to 53. And I would love to have a volunteer for that. It looks like Jason is kind enough to find someone for us.
Deuteronomy 28, what?
28 verses 49 to 53, please.
The Lord will bring a nation against you from far away, from the ends of the earth, like the eagle swooping down, a nation whose language will not understand. A fierce-looking nation without respect for the old or pity for the young, that will devour the young of the livestock and the crops of your land until you are destroyed. They will leave you no grain, no wine or olive oil, nor any calves of your herds or lambs of your flocks until you are ruined. How far? Okay. They will lay siege to all the cities throughout your land until the high fortified walls in which you trust fall down. They will besiege all the cities throughout the land the Lord your God is giving you. Because of the suffering of your enemy will inflict on you during the siege, you will eat the fruit of the womb, the flesh of the sons and daughters the Lord your God has given you.
Much. So what was just read, and I'm drawing a blank, I'm forgetting your name, my brother. It is part of the curses that God gives out against the Israelites if they choose not to follow him. That's where this is part of that section there. Now, I would like you all to think about these words, this language, and the potential prophecy that's laid forth as we are now going to reread Habakkuk 1, verses 5 through 11. If I could get a volunteer for that. Brother Randy, thank you.
Behold ye among the heathen, and regard, and wonder marvelously. For I will work a work in your days which you will not believe, though it be told you. For lo, I raise up the Chaldeans, that bitter and hasty nation, which shall march through the breadth of the land to possess the dwelling places that are not theirs. They are terrible and dreadful. Their judgment and their dignity shall proceed proceed of themselves. Their horses also are swifter than the leopards, and are more fierce than the evening wolves. And their horsemen shall spread themselves, and their horsemen shall come from afar. They shall fly as the eagle that hasteth to eat. They shall come all for violence. Their faces shall sup up as the east wind, and they shall gather the captivity as the sand. And they shall scoff at the kings, and the princes shall be a scorn to them. They shall deride every stronghold, for they shall heap dust and take it. Then shall his mind change, and he shall pass over and offend, imputing this his power to his God.
Thank you again, Brother Randy. Anyone notice the very almost striking similarities between these passages? What is similar between the two of them? Mentioning the eagle, right? Swooping down to devour. Yep. What else?
They're fierce.
They are fierce. Yep.
It's interesting because that section in Deuteronomy I had marked as the Romans, which I
Right.
think is still fitting because the Romans were an eagle.
Yeah.
And I had the Babylonians marked the previous section, but it's the language is a lot more, it's not quite as, it's a bit more wafty.
Yeah, I'm not a scholar of prophecy, but when I see characteristics that seem to line up, like both talking about a nation from afar, both talking about the idea that this is a ruthless nation, an impetuous nation, the idea of laughing or scorning siege ramps. I mean, there's a lot of similarities that I believe God was trying to show us, even all the way back in Deuteronomy, the idea of he had a plan for this nation of Babylonians that we wouldn't even have thought about back in Moses' time. And I believe as time progressed, God revealed more and more to his prophets as events came closer to climax. And that was, at least from what I gathered, potentially part of the way that he had everything set up there. Oh, Rob, thank you.
Well, the other part about it is, like they were talking, not sure who was talking back there about the Romans. If you look at this, this is repeated multiple times. It's multiple times he's trying to give you an idea of correcting things. In Deuteronomy, on the Old Testament side, he was doing that. Here he does it with this one, almost the same exact verbiage. And now you look at the Romans, it's the same verbiage again, okay? But when the Romans came, their main standard was an eagle, okay? They were fast, they were violent, they had their own gods. This theme keeps being repeated time and time again throughout time. It's almost like a father talking to his kids. How many times do I have to remind you? It's that type of thing.
Love that analogy of a father talking to his kid, because that is really what we are dealing with in the sense of God dealing with the Jews and dealing with us. Thank you. That's a lovely image to think about. In the same stream of thought, I wanted to turn up 2 Chronicles 36, verses 15 to 21. 2 Chronicles 36, 15 to 21. Really, all of 2 Kings chapters 23 to 25 and 2 Chronicles chapter 36 does a great job of understanding the events of the end times for the kingdom of Judah. But I wanted to focus more on the prophetic significance of this, and that's why we'll just read 2 Chronicles 36, verses 15 to 21.
The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them again and again by his messengers, because he had compassion on his people and on his dwelling place. But they continually mocked the messengers of God, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord arose against his people, until there was no remedy. Therefore he brought up against them the king of the Chaldeans, who slew their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young man or virgin, old man or infirm. He gave them all into his hand. All the articles of the house of God, great and small, and the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his officers, he brought them all to Babylon. Then they burned the house of God, and broke down the wall of Jerusalem, and burned all its fortified buildings with fire, and destroyed all its valuable articles. Those who had escaped from the sword he carried away to Babylon, and they were servants to him and to his sons until the rule of the kingdom of Persia, to fulfill the word of the Lord by the mouth of Jeremiah, until the land had enjoyed its Sabbaths. All the days of its desolation it kept Sabbath until 70 years were complete.
Thank you very much, Sister Ellen. So, once again, similar vernacular, talking specifically about the kings of Chaldean, Babylon. I personally loved seeing and witnessing God's multiple century plan come to fruition and seeing the similarities. I just am always amazed when I see everything tying in together. And in Second Chronicles 36, we are able to see how Babylon further fulfills the promised destruction that was foretold potentially in Deuteronomy and other places. I couldn't help when I was looking at all this, thinking about your graph, Perry, from last Sunday in relation to the whole stream of threads about how everything is tied together, and just being encouraged and appreciating God's infinite might, wisdom, and foresight, being able to play a worldwide chess game on a global stage, trillions and trillions of moves ahead of anyone who could ever see things, unless we are able to look back in time. There was another point that I thought was interesting, and when Jeremiah is talking about the destroyer from the north, there seems to be potential parallels in the language to what Babylon was going to do and what Babylon is described as. But as I said, I'm not a scholar, so I didn't want to go too deep and too far down that path without checking with other people if that seems to make sense, that the destroyer from the north is indeed potentially Babylon. I'm curious if there's any more prophetic scholars than I out here who know more about that idea. And the reason I would say it's potentially Babylon is because Babylon would have had to come up through the Euphrates and Tigris and then come down from the north in order to attack against Israel. So it seemed that there would be possible connection. I'm just curious if there are any other thoughts to elaborate on this one.
There is a destroyer that comes out of the north, and I hadn't put together the eagle being with each of these attackers, but yeah, it's kind of fitting for Babylon, and then later it's fitting for Rome. And it's interesting that one of the symbols for Russia is the eagle, but it's two-headed. It's like a double portion. But in each of those three cases, and even with the Assyrians as well, the judgment comes sweeping down directly out of the north.
It makes sense because to the east is all desert land, and not many people could actually traverse that in a big, massive army. And thank you for bringing that up. Any other thoughts about this potential correlation, Rob? Thank you.
The other part about it, if you take a look at the geography of Israel, okay, if you go directly east for majority of Israel, you're talking about the Dead Sea. It's not passable, okay, by most technologies at the time. The only real way into Israel is literally through the north. So pretty much the only way to invade is from the north. From to the south on the Sinai Peninsula, it's almost impossible to traverse. It's predominantly soft sand. So everything has to come out of there. And talking about the eagles and everything else, if you look at symbology out of all the other countries and everything in the areas, even back in those times, the eagle was prominent in almost every single culture there except Israel. Even the Egyptians had eagles in their culture. Israel is pretty much the only group in the Middle East that doesn't have an eagle as part of their culture.
Aware of that, thank you. I really appreciate that. All righty, so I'm now planning to move towards the idea of looking for Jesus in these verses. It was not necessarily an easy thing for me to initially start off. I'm curious if you guys see Jesus, or if anything screams out to you tied to Jesus when you first look at these verses. If I'll give you a hint, what if you looked at it as Babylon being the antithesis of Jesus, as being the opposite of what Jesus is supposed to be? Kathy, do you have a thought? You could potentially look at that way. Give you an idea of what I came up with. Unlike this bitter and hasty nation, right? That's what Babylon is described as. Jesus waits for God's timing before he acts, right? Instead of setting up the kingdom then in his time, instead of doing everything that he wants right then and there, making it so that we are not able to be a part of that, he waits now 2,000 some odd years for God's plan to come into fruition. That was one of the ways I saw Jesus in here. Are there other ways? Jason Winterland.
For the antithesis part, I guess maybe verse 11, it talks about him changing his mind and then giving his power to his God, ascribing it to his God. And you just think if it's talking about the Chaldeans or the Babylonians, when Daniel was in Babylon, the God that Nebuchadnezzar set up was that image of himself, this golden image. And Jesus was the opposite of that. He was always giving honor to his Father, depriving himself, becoming a servant. So I don't know, there's definitely a big contrast there in how these leaders viewed themselves with how Jesus viewed himself and his mission.
I really appreciate that one. That was great. Thank you.
To tie in with all that, if you remember Roger's talk on Revelations, he was talked about it as it's not just one event, it's multiple events. So if you take a look at the Babylonians and Israel at the time, and using your thing of the anti-thing, it's the exact same scenario as the start of Revelations, talking about the coming of the Antichrist and everything throughout all that stuff. History is repeating itself time and time again to the ultimate event of the second coming. You see Jesus in here is because God's prepping Israel for that event. Okay? They're having to go through these trials. They're not ready yet for Jesus to come, Jesus to physically show up and change and start changing things. So he's prepping that over time. The Babylonians, you read the stuff you just talked about with holding the Sabbath and for 70 years in captivity and everything else. It took them 70 years before they got back to that, where he thought they were ready to go to the next step. It's that long-term plan you're talking about. We're talking centuries here. If they're not ready, he's not ready to send Jesus Christ. So he has to prep on that. Every single time he does this, he's checking to see, are they ready yet? Are they ready yet? No. And finally he thinks they're ready when, again, Jesus to us to start the changes that literally changed the world. Okay, and then when the final chapters in Revelation, when everything starts changing and all that, the world will be in such a dismal state. Okay, Jesus will literally have the ability to literally be a beacon for everybody. Okay, that can't happen yet. Even nowadays, it can't happen. It couldn't happen back then.
Great point. Other thoughts about seeing Jesus in this section?
So, and it was also alluded to here, this reminds me of the four faces of the cherubim. You have, obviously, the eagle shows up there, the man, which is the Lord Jesus, although in the sense of the coming of the Babylonians and Chaldeans, it's always represented by a man. In other words, you think of like the Caesars of Rome, or Pharaoh's not really mentioned there in what we're talking about, Nebuchadnezzar, things like that. So we have the man, we have the eagle, we have the lion from the tribe of Judah, and of course we have the ox. And by the way, that description in Ezekiel is very fierce, very scary, and I think it sets up this idea of the coming of the Lord much differently than his first ministry, as being very meek and things like that. And I don't think, as I said earlier, I don't think the world's ready for this. I don't think they have any idea of the power and the destructive nature that the Lord is going to come and, control the earth. I mean, it is not, mentions here about them being very afraid of the Chaldeans and all that. Well, fear is going to be an issue when the Lord comes back too. Very much afraid.
Appreciate that. A couple other ones I had. Unlike the Babylonians who rely on their own judgment, Jesus judges according to God's will. He makes no decision outside of what God would want. And I love how Jason Winterland brought out the idea of the difference between worshiping oneself, like Babylon, or like Nebuchadnezzar did, unlike Jesus, who was able to focus on God, and that's his worship force. And in that, I had something along the same lines, which was, instead of worshiping man's strength or the man-made gods, Jesus gives all the credit to God. And there was one verse I took slightly out of context. I hope you bear with me. If you look at verse 5 and the idea of how everyone is utterly astounded and are not expecting or believing that something like this could happen, there's the idea that it could be the same way, as I think Brother Jerry brought out, in Christ's return, and that there would be a similar response by those in our world today. So those were a couple of the things I found in relation to Jesus. Was there anything else anyone else noticed or thought about? Now, as I said, I love studying Scripture, but I want to make certain that I can apply whatever we're learning in our life and walk as Christ followers. So what lessons can we glean from this little bit of prophecy that God has given us in relation to the Babylonians coming against the Jews? What can we take from what we just read, and what can we apply into our lives as Christians? What can we say, I can use this as a tool, or I can use this as a source of inspiration or encouragement as a follower of Christ? Jason?
I'll start it up. So God cares about how we behave and is willing to punish or to try and correct in order to change our behavior if we're willing to accept it.
Owen?
I was thinking mostly about verse 11, which happened, I think, multiple times in Israel's life, and it's going to happen again, is that even though some country or government or whatever, or just people, create havoc and hurt you, in the end, God's going to punish them also.
Mm-hmm.
We're supposed to be able to see something of ourselves in every part of Scripture that we read, and obviously we see a whole diverse, spectrum of experiences in people. And I think one of the things that we can take away from the captivity, or the impending captivity, would be that we're often captives in our own lives to decisions we've made, choices we've made. We've known better, just as they knew better. We knew what the consequences would end up being, but God doesn't just leave us there. He shows us examples of people in captivity and how they, both rightly and wrongly, handled that situation. So I think that's certainly something we can take from this.
Brother Walter in the back.
So Brother Paul Martin had some thoughts he wanted to share, and I'll kind of put them in there somewhere. Actually, I think some of them are pretty good. So the first thing he said, the disobedience of his children, I mean God's children, had consequences as he had promised. Blessings are cursed. So for us, the disobedience or faith and obedience has those same things. We either have reward or we have the punishment, in the sense of where our disobedience loves us. He gave us his example. He said, Babylon came out of Babel, where they rebelled against God and did not go out like God had told them. Their language was confused, and we know that the Israelites lost a lot of their language while in captivity in Babylon. How often, if you think about it, while we're in this wilderness, this Babylon, does the language of the truth get taken away if we're not careful and steadfast? That, there's so many different Protestant religions and denominations and things. If we're not careful, something sounds right, and we begin to believe, as they did in the garden, a lie. As a classic example, he said, well, while they were in captivity, Aramaic replaced Hebrew, which is similar to Hebrew, but it's not the same. And we remember from some of the other classes we've seen, it wasn't until Israel became a state again that their language was rediscovered and reintroduced to them. And so what happens to us when we lose our language? How long will it take for us to come back and find the language of the truth? And so his last comment to us is, we need to trust in God no matter what we face. The trials and tribulations, he chastens those he loves and changes and makes them better if we'll but listen.
Those comments, Paul, those were fantastic. Thank you very much. Any other thoughts about lessons that we can apply in our own life? Rob?
But one of the big things and everything, and you take a look at verse 5, right? 5? Was it 5? Was it 6? Yeah. Where he talks about he's working during our days, and we'd be astounded. How many times have each of us seen things in the news or whatever going around the world and be absolutely stunned the fact that it actually can happen? We call them miracles and everything else, okay, because they happen so rarely. But if you read the way God's list talking in here is, those aren't miracles and everything else. He expects that to be an everyday occurrence. It should happen more often if we follow his guidance. If we don't follow it, we suffer the consequences. That's part of his thing with free will. He says, we're free to do anything we want, but we have to suffer the consequences of not following the guidance we're given. Okay? And it continues on. You see it more often. You see the miracles of life and everything. So our choices dictate what's going to happen. He understands that things are not going to go right. Okay? We'll suffer the consequences. We'll learn from them and continue growing. But that's the idea.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Brother Perry.
Hate to be a bit of a negative, but I see this passage just as a big warning, right? So God had a lot of compassion and patience with them, sent them prophet after prophet, and they just would slay them and go about their business and go up and worship their other gods and dance around the trees and do whatever else they did. And there was harsh consequences to that. And he brought the Babylonians against them in the hope that the people in Babylon might repent and perhaps their children would, which, ultimately some of them did. But as far as applying that to us, it should be a warning to us in that, the world around us is pretty evil, and unless you take a hard look at it, it's easy to justify some of that behavior, and it creeps into our lives and into our ecclesias and whatnot. And Christ says, when I return, will I find the faith? And so that's a challenge to us, that we do have to be in the world but not of the world. And where's that line in the sand? And it might be different for all of us, but at the end of the day, what is expected of us is to emulate God, which is a pretty high calling. So there's that.
You're right to bring out that point. There is that definite sense of concern that we need to have for our own selves in relation to that, and the warning that there is for all of us, right?
So there's a comment that Jesus makes to a man that he healed. He says, "See, you are well again. Stop sinning, or something worse may happen to you." So God oftentimes sends to us little things that are meant to discipline us. And if we don't listen, we don't hear, something more comes trying to get us on the right path. Because he doesn't want anyone to perish.
I would concur with what everybody's saying, but I just think it's a slippery slope in that bad things still happen to good people, just because you're a follower of Christ and you're trying to always do the right thing doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen to you. But I think your perspective's different. I think if you are in the household or you're a believer, you know that bad things will still happen, but you're trying to look for the God lesson. You're trying to look for where he's directing you, what's going to happen with that.
Something that we got to see very clearly within the very first 4 verses, which is why it took so long to get through them, was because of just how much was there to impact on the idea that good happens to both the righteous and the unrighteous, and that bad happens to the good and the wicked. There's this tendency that we will say that it is not fair if we only think according to man's wisdom, but with God's wisdom, we can actually see a bigger and more important lesson. And I didn't expect to not get through all my notes, so we are right at time, and I am looking forward to continuing this again with you all next week.